is Paco Garcia. I'm the CTO of Yoti, and I'm going to be talking today about biometrics as an extra factor of authentication in smartphones. So how many people have heard about Yoti, actually? Because we're pre-launch, so I suspect not many of you have heard about it. Raise your hand. So I'm not a sales guy, so I'm not going to get into the sales pitch. So you can check our website. But it's basically a user-centric identity platform that uses biometrics to prove your identity in person and online. So let's get started. So I suspect pretty much everyone here has a really good understanding on what identification is and what authentication is and what the differences are. But so we start from the same page. Let me just quickly touch on those points. So identification is trying to answer the question, who are you? That's really easy. I just did it a minute ago. Yeah? Now, the hard part, what makes you really special is the ability to actually prove it. Yeah? And that's where the authentication comes into place. So if we take a look at the classic classification of classes of authentication, so knowledge base, ownership, and inherence, identification is quite straightforward in the knowledge like factors and ownership factors, but it's a bit less clear. You know, it's not that black and white classification on the inherence factors. So on the knowledge, an identification could be something like your username or email address. The way you authenticate is with a secret, right? Something that you only know. That could be the typical password or the PIN code or an answer to a security question. Now, it has its disadvantages, like what we know about, you could actually forget a password, or it can be phished. And it has also some advantages, like it can be kept secret, and it can also be changed. In terms of ownership, something that you could do actually is use one of these security keys, like we've been seeing here in the FIDO Alliance. That has a private key stored in a security element in the device that can be actually be used to sign a challenge, and that's how you actually authenticate yourself. And the identification element could be something as simple as that public key that belongs to that key pair. So again, it's deterministic. It's very easy to basically understand the difference between how you identify and how you authenticate. But the problems with the next one, the inherence, is that it's not that clear. That line is not, it's a bit of a gray area. Because inherence is about an intrinsic property about yourself. Yeah, it's something that cannot be changed. And that could be a problem. It's both a blessing and a curse. Because you don't forget your face, you don't forget your ECC card, so like pulse rate, you don't forget the way you walk. Yeah, so we are going into the realm of behavioral biometrics. But it has the challenge that once that raw biometrics gets compromised, it could be a problem to be used for further authentication. It's also important to understand what's the scenario of the authentication. So are we talking about in-person authentication? In that case, it's much simpler to authenticate a biometric. So think about border control when you came here. Those of you that have flown into the US, and then you show your passport, which is a ownership factor. The authenticity of that passport can be basically assessed with proper training, proper equipment. So you could look into things like the infrared, the ultraviolet security elements on the passport. Recently, since the ICAO, the International Aviation Civil Organization, published the 9303 standard, you can actually verify that with cryptography as well. Now, the problem with the basic access control of ICAO is that can be actually cloned. That biochip in your passport can be trivially basically transferred to another chip. But they are working on the more advanced access control that also has a private key that will prevent from that trivial cloning. The important thing of your passport and what makes it such a good proof of identity is that it also has a biometric. It has a digital picture of yourself. According to the ICAO standard, your biographic information is stored in the data group 1, and that digital picture of yourself is stored in the data group 2. Everything gets hashed together into a secure object datagram, and it gets signed with a private key of the issuing government. That can be verified. And when you go to the border control, you're basically in face-to-face with the border control officer, right? So he can assess that you're not wearing a mask or wearing a picture of someone else, or you've got something dodgy on your fingerprints. So it's much easier to check for the integrity and for the authentication of biometric element when you're in an in-person validation scenario. Now, the big question is, what happens when you go online? Things can get a bit complicated. This is, by the way, an actual 3D mask from a Japanese company called Real F. Everything that it takes is just taking a couple of pictures from different angles, and then they can reproduce a really high fidelity model of your face. So I must confess I was tempted to try this, to go over border control, but I wanted to be talking to you today, so I refrained myself from doing it. Now the question is, in an online scenario, you're limited, right? The amount of information that's available is much less than in an in-person validation. You've got a sensor, you've got a certain bandwidth, and you've got some real-time requirements in terms of how quickly you can do that validation. So to answer that question, if you can trust biometrics online, what I like to do is basically cover a little bit of the generic system design of a generic biometric system. So this is actually a diagram that was published by NIST early this year. They're working on a document that is basically trying to assess the strength of biometrics online. Something happened on the footnote, therefore it's not there, but it's their credit. So this is just sort of showing different attack vectors that can be basically, it can try to basically hack into a biometric system, right? So what could go wrong, yeah? 11 different attack vectors. The thing is that it's not as bad as it looks like, because from the second to third attack vector, actually, everything there can be mitigated if you are careful about how you design the system. So you could actually put everything in a silicon chip, and that's the approach that many biometric sensor manufacturers are taking these days. So they embed everything in the silicon, therefore it's more difficult to basically modify any of the scores or the decision of biometric templates. In the smartphones today, we've got Apple, we've got Android as the main place in this space. So what they do is that they use something called a trusted execution environment and secure element, where they store the biometric templates, and then they have a way to basically execute the biometric matching in a trusted environment, so it cannot be tampered with. Now, the problem is that in the case of Apple, they don't open it up to other developers to basically do anything else with that trusted execution environment. It's just it's a no-go. And what they've done is basically they give you an API to the fingerprint sensor that uses what they basically designed and implemented. But if you wanted to do something like facial recognition with an Apple device, then you cannot use the trusted execution environment. Now, Android is a bit better, because the high-end devices, they have something called, most of them have an ARM trust zone and something called a trusted execution environment that by a third-party vendor, they can actually give you access to that trusted execution environment, and then you can execute those sensitive operations there. But the problem with Android is the diversity and the fragmentation, yeah? You've got also low-end devices that don't offer you that possibility. So another approach you could take here is actually getting to do all the signal processing, comparison, data storage, and decision, not on the device, but on a server, where you actually trust the execution environment in there. But a common attack vector that is applicable to both iPhone, Android devices, regardless of its device-level security or server-side security, is the presentation attack. Now, the presentation attack is also known as a spoofing attack. So looking at the bit of the timeline of anti-spoofing, this is actually quite an old thing. The first appearance of a spoof biometric happened actually 100 years ago, and it was in the literature, but literally literature, because it was not the academic literature. It was actually a novel from Conan Doyle called The Return of Sherlock Holmes. So that was the first evidence of a spoof attack of basically someone lifting a fingerprint and trying to incriminate someone else in a crime scene. It took 20 years to get the first academic research on the area. And then from there to today, there's basically a number of milestones. Perhaps the most important one has been the tabula rasa study, which was financed by the European Commission, FP7. And that was basically getting together a number of academics all over the world to basically understand and study what can be done to basically detect these spoof attacks. And the latest and greatest milestone is the handbook of biometrics anti-spoofing, which I strongly recommend you to have a read if this is something that interests you. Full disclosure, some of the guys that actually wrote the handbook are working with us. So it's a good book. You should go and buy it if you want to, but I didn't say anything about that. So let's take a look at the, where we are today. Yeah, what's available in the smartphones today, what's coming in the future as well, what can be done. So how many of you have a smartphone with a fingerprint sensor device? Yeah, pretty much almost like 70% of the audience has one of those. Now, those of you, how many would actually trust that fingerprint sensor to prove your identity? And when I say identity, I mean all your online accounts or your bank accounts, everything that is connected to your identity. So yeah, not that many actually. Yeah, so that would be like 30% of the 70% that raise their hand. The reason is that it was designed to basically unlock your phone, but nothing else. So the sensor that is used in the first generation of iPhones and second generation is just a capacitive sensor. So it can be fooled, it can be spoofed, as it was demonstrated in the Chaos Computing Club conference a couple of years ago. And even more recently, early this year in the Mobile World Congress, with just a little bit of Play-Doh. So yeah, it's good as an identification process, but in terms of authentication, it's better than nothing, but it can be improved. And the reason it's better than nothing is because it takes 5 minutes to get someone, to get that fingerprint into a dental mold to basically get a, high-resolution copy of that fingerprint, and lifting that fingerprint from basically the glass of the device, or from a plastic glass or anything like that. It takes a lot of expertise. So it's not something that anyone can do. So it brings you an extra level of confidence, but it's definitely far from perfect. So another sensor that we've seen actually on financial services, so banks have some of this. It's actually a different type of technology called finger vein scanning technology. So it's not looking into the fingerprint. It's actually looking into the vein patterns inside your fingers. Now, the advantages of this is that you don't leave them everywhere, right? So it's a bit more secret, right? The problem with this is that, and the reason perhaps why we haven't seen them in the smartphones is that it's very difficult to integrate in a flat, so like a form factor, which seems to be the driver for smartphones today. So we haven't seen many of those. However, it can be also spoofed, because the way it works is with an infrared sensor, infrared light, which is a very low-cost LED. You basically project that on your finger, and then the blood cells absorb that infrared emission, and therefore, on the CCD camera, you can see that pattern of the veins. But if you manage to basically get that pattern from someone, there's nothing stopping you from printing that with some infrared ink and spoof the sensor. Again, this is the trend. We see more sophisticated sensors. It takes more effort. It takes more cost to basically spoof the sensor. So what's coming in the future? We've seen companies like Qualcomm and Synaptics developing this so like third generation fingerprint sensors, which actually is using ultrasonic sounds to basically map a 3D model of your finger. Now, it doesn't stop there. Actually, with that ultrasounds, you can get also a bit of a understanding of the vein patterns as well. And you could do things as well, like detecting a heartbeat with those ultrasounds. So it's quite a way more robust approach. One of the benefits of the ultrasound fingerprint technology is that you can integrate it behind the glass. So it doesn't need to be a sensor specifically where you put your finger. So we will start to see more and more devices that actually integrate this technology, not just in one region of the screen, but all over the screen. So that's opening the new possibilities, like continuous biometric authentication, which is something definitely more robust to basically raise that authentication and that confidence of the biometrics. However, and there's always a however, we've seen also 3D printed organs coming in the future, right? So the technology is coming to a point where you could actually 3D print a finger, you could 3D print a heart, you could 3D print a number of things. So the trend, again, the cost rises, the barrier goes higher, it's more complicated to fool the sensor, but it's never 100% secure. There's always a race between the sensor technology and the sophistication of the attacks. But the long-term convergence is that the price goes higher and the levels of sophistication goes higher. So in the future, it will be extremely costly to spoof these kind of sensors. So this is more or less like the what can be done in terms of the sensor level technology, which is all hardware. But there's a number of anti-spoofing techniques that you can perform to mitigate the impact of spoof attacks. So a typical classification is this one. So one of the techniques is about checking the intrinsic properties of a biometric. So the picture there, for example, is looking into a multispectral scanner of a finger. So you can actually detect the intrinsic properties of a finger compared to a prosthetic finger. And that could be easily classified into a spoof attack or not. Another technique that can be used is the liveness detection. We've seen at this conference a really good biometric device, the 9mm band, which is actually doing that. It's looking into the ECC. So that's not the pulse rate, by the way. That's the profile of how your heartbeat work. But it can be used to basically assess if it's a living person in control of that device. Other techniques, which are more software-based rather than hardware, are the active challenge anti-spoofing technique. So we've seen in the industry the first instances of this with MasterCard, for example, where they've got the selfie pay, where they ask you to wink, when you're going to pay. So it's still, it's not very sophisticated because with a replay attack, you can actually play that wink operation whenever you're requested. But it can get more and more sophisticated. So you could ask actually the person to say a number of random words, and then you could do something like artificial intelligence to do lip reading on the backend system to assess if those random words are matched to the movements on your lips. You move into the multimodal biometric anti-spoofing techniques, because now you've got also voice, also the biometrics which look into not only the face or the voice, but also the dynamics of how your face moves. Another technique or area of interest is the behavioral biometrics. It's very difficult to basically reproduce a behavior. It can be done, but it gives you an extra level of confidence. Another technique is the counterfeit detection. So this one is a sample of a spoof attack of a picture of someone on a display. So if you pay attention, you can look at some artifacts in the picture that can be used to basically discard that as a genuine biometric login. So you could see things like reflections, you could see things like borders. If you pay really close attention, you could see a bit of the moire effect, which is what happens when you actually take a picture from a screen. You could see these artifacts coming into the image. This could be actually extrapolated to more sophisticated things. So we're going to dive into the counterfeit detection, what can be done. There's a technique called texture analysis. So this is looking into basically what artifacts can you see in the textures of the face. So if you take a picture of a picture, then you will start seeing artifacts in terms of the, the pixels or the resolution compared to the real face. So there's a descriptor called local binary patterns that can be used to look into these things. Another classical descriptors in the academia is the HOC, which is looking at the histogram of gradients. So that's looking at how curvy your face is. It's looking for edges. It's looking for those kind of imperfections. Now, you could combine a number of descriptors to actually assess the accuracy of how confident you are that this is a spoof attack or this is actually a genuine. So it takes a lot of data to basically train the machine learning to a decent state where you achieve this kind of accuracy. But it can be done. The academia has done it. We've done it ourselves with our data. We've achieved a 97.5% accuracy. Yeah? So there's always a trade-off, like in the biometric matches between the false positives and the false negatives. It's always a balance that you need to get right. But the message is that this technique alone is not enough, right? You need to basically have an anti-spoofing engine that encompasses a number of techniques from what we've seen before in the software, in the hardware, if you want to be really sure that it's the person behind the device. Another thing that can be done is actually look into different modalities of biometrics. One of the good things is that it's not only increasing the confidence on the authentication of biometric, but it's also increasing the accuracy on the matching rate. So this is just a plot that basically takes the face scores, fingerprint scores, and hand geometry scores. You can see here that it's quite orthogonal, right? So you could classify it and then add up in terms of accuracy and in terms of anti-spoofing, because also it makes it much more complicated for the attacker to find biometrics for all the different modes, right? So maybe they get your fingerprints on the screen of the phone, or maybe they get a picture of yourself inside the phone, but maybe they don't get the fingerprint voice, or maybe they don't get a good profile of your behavioral biometrics. So it's definitely adding up in terms of security. So that's pretty much the message. So multimodal biometrics and artificial intelligence can help to increase the level of confidence we've got in biometric authentication. And the other big message is that the sensors are getting more and more sophisticated. So as time goes by, the cost of attack will also rise. And at some point, it will become impractical. So today, we can just have a bit like a risk assessment, and given a level of assurance required, you can accept one biometric or one technique. But biometrics in smartphones are definitely here to stay. And the reason for that is because it's convenient for the user. I was yesterday holding one of these 2 kilos alligators with my left hand, and I was trying to unlock my phone. Yeah, I don't see myself like putting my username and password there. I just use the fingerprint sensor. This is what the user wants. The problem is that there's a lot of information. Devices are going to start getting to know us much better. So there's a bit of a privacy issue. What happens with that data? It needs to be handled properly. So that's what we've been working on in Yoti for the last couple of years. We've been working on a user-centric identity platform that uses biometrics and secures the privacy and the data of the user. This doesn't go to a central server. It's basically all stored in the device. It's all secure in there. It cannot be basically hacked if someone breaches into the central data base, because it's all segregated and fragmented across the user's devices. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So thank you very much. And I think we've got some time for questions. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you can treat behavioral biometrics as another mode of biometrics, really. You could look into things like, the way you type a PIN code, the dynamics of those keystroking, also the gait, the way you walk, because your phone is basically 100. Well, in my case, most of the time with me, it's learning by the accelerometer and the gyroscope, the way I walk, the way I hold the device, these kind of things. So it's an extra mode of biometrics that can be used to secure, basically, make the your security input biometrics stronger. Yep.
So one other problem with biometrics is when things change, right? So if you're using someone's gait and they stub their toe and start to limp, then their gait is changed. Or if you're using facial recognition and somebody gets burned on their face or whatever, things change. And so you have to have a way to redo their biometrics, so recover their identity.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
So, and that's one of the reasons why, just having one biometric just doesn't work. You need to have a combination of them. So if, something happens and I lose my voice, and the system only uses voice recognition and voice biometrics to identify myself, I should be able to recover, that account and disable that biometric, and basically use all the biometrics or the factors of authentication to basically drive the configuration of that authentication vector.
And also along the same, if I could follow up along the same lines as people who are visually impaired, a lot of these biometrics kind of require you to be able to see and respond to visual cues.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So if you take the active challenge anti-spoofing technique, right? So that's going to ask you to wink at some point, in the less sophisticated version. You could still, if that person is visually impaired, you could ask him, by just a sound there are a number of techniques that can be used, but it's just one anti-spoofing technique. It's not the only one. That's the idea. Okay. Gentleman in the middle.
What can you tell about the various biometrics and the accuracy of those in terms of using one or more biometrics as an authentication mean? The accuracy of the algorithms for each of the biometrics.
Yeah, so take, for example, the fingerprint sensor in the iPhone. That's 1 in a million, so like false positive rates and false negative rates. I guess the question is, how does add up if you add another biometric? So as long as the other biometric is orthogonal, the accuracy actually adds up as well. Yeah, there's no interdependency between those biometrics. Now, if you look into a biometric that is not orthogonal to the other one, then the accuracy doesn't, add up mathematically. There will be a bit of an improvement, or there might be actually some interference, some destructive interference, and actually have a less accuracy on the matching.
But the accuracy of the biometrics modalities differs greatly one from the other. So how is it that the combination of biometrics is going to increase security or, be more accurate in authentication when the modalities themselves and the accuracy of the algorithms are totally, day and night?
Okay.
For instance, if you take it from top to bottom, best matching algorithm to the least accurate, iris is number 1.
Yep.
Okay, and then it's followed by fingerprints, and then it's followed by face. But the problem is that there aren't standards for most of the biometric modalities, with the exception of fingers and iris. The others don't have standards.
Yeah.
Face is one that is, many vendors mislead customers thinking that my face recognition algorithm is better than yours, when in fact, for the most part, they're all crap unless you have a frontal face image and it's nice and clean.
Yeah, I understand now better the question. So, yeah, there is a problem that if there is a massive difference between the accuracy of one biometric and another, actually, you will just go for the best one, because the accuracy of the other is going to be irrelevant. So this is applicable for biometrics that have a similar level of accuracy. So if you look, for example, at the fingerprint matching rate and the finger vein matching rate is similar. Therefore, it can be applied in that scenario. But I take your point that if you've got a DNA biometric or a retina scanner biometric, that's actually going to be on top of accuracy.
Oh, we got DNA.
Yeah.
DNA doesn't get any better than that, but we don't have DNA sensors on the fly.
Yeah.
Or DNA analysis on the fly yet.
Yeah.
I mean, it's moving in that direction.
Yeah. Other question?
If in the spirit of sort of that question, it might be useful for people to think about the threat model that you're trying, of the environment you're trying to deal with. Because, so, little background, Director of Product Management, Contact Labs, Fido Alliance, did the Sensing Galaxy S5, S6, Arrow, and a bunch of other biometric ones. One of the challenges is that many of the questions around biometric efficacy is mostly driven by a view of server-side biometrics, where the accuracy, the spoofing, and all of these are very important. Because fundamentally, it's not that much different than giving a password. Really long, really complicated password. And that's where it's important. If you're a government agency where you're nation state, and that's the kind of thing you're concerned about for the purpose of customs border control, that's a viable model. If, however, your threat model is a distributed, heterogeneous population of consumer devices, a much better option is to look at biometrics where you're using secure hardware on the device to authenticate locally to unlock a cryptographic secret. Because in that case, your threat model changes. The threat model is no longer, do I bypass your face recognition system with a photo or something? Now I have to get your device as well. Now, a very targeted attack, yes, you can bypass with, I steal your phone and I use Play-Doh to bypass your fingerprint sensor. Totally viable. Can be done. But it can't be done remote. And it can't be done scalably. And really, if you think fundamentally in a consumer context, as well as some enterprise context, the fundamental problem that you're dealing with authentication is a remote scalable attack when someone steals a credential that can be phished, it can be guessed, it can be socially engineered, and not only that, no matter how great your security is around your users' passwords, guess what? They just used it on the worst site on the internet. So it doesn't matter how good your password policy is. So that's an alternative approach. It may not be appropriate for all, though. There are applications where it makes sense to do server-side, and everything about spoofing is absolutely accurate.
Yeah. One of the challenges, I guess, with the device level security, and it has all the advantages that you've mentioned, is that what happens when you lose that device? Yeah. What's the recovery process? And if you introduce the weak link on the recovery process, then all the nice stuff that you get about the security of the device, it gets pretty much lost.
Bar the door and then goes to the windows.
Yeah, pretty much. So I think we've got time for our last question.
So,
Yeah.
You mentioned that you can deploy some of the steps of the biometric verification to the server side as a possible way to mitigate some vectors. I do worry that that would open for possible privacy leaks, privacy information. Is there any mainstream implementation that does that, like server side biometric verification process?
Yeah, so it's a very good question, because if you put all these biometrics in a central database, it's a honeypot for attackers to get into.
You can't hash them, right?
Right,
You need
but
to keep the real thing.
sure, but there are things that you could do, right? So in a biometric crypto system, you could actually encrypt some of those biometrics with a key that is stored in the device. So that key can be passed on transient to the server side to do the operations that it needs to do in a very basically limited time window, right? So the vulnerability of that biometric is connected to that time window. Now, once the authentication has taken place, that cryptographic key can be basically completely deleted from the central server. And therefore, if a hacker managed to get access to that central database, they're still missing the cryptographic key, which happens to be stored in the device of the user. So there are some techniques that will help you to mitigate these kind of scenarios. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone.